Somewhere beneath the sands of Iraq, archaeologists uncovered something impossible. Clay tablets, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, carved with symbols that described a catastrophe so vast it shouldn't exist. A flood, complete, total, world-ending. But here's what makes it impossible. The flood these tablets describe happened before the great flood we've always known, before Noah, before Genesis, before the story we thought began everything. The Sumerians, humanity's first civilization, pressed these words into wet clay 5,000 years ago. They wrote about kings who ruled for impossible lifetimes, about cities that rose from nothing, about waters that covered mountains and erased the world. And beneath every word, there's a question that archaeologists have whispered for more than a century. What if they were remembering something real? Picture a world lit only by oil lamps and moonlight, where every river carried stories, and the first cities rose from dust and dreams. The Tigris and Euphrates flow through valleys that have seen empires rise and fall like breath. The air shimmers with heat. The ground cracks beneath relentless sun, and scattered across this ancient land, fragments of clay still wait, each tablet a frozen moment, each wedge-shaped mark, pressed by fingers that witness something we can barely imagine. The Sumerians called themselves the black-headed people. They built ziggurats that touched the clouds. They invented writing not for poetry, but for something more urgent. They needed to remember. They needed to preserve what had almost been lost. Because somewhere in their collective memory, in stories passed from grandmother to grandchild across generations that stretched back into darkness, they carried the echo of a world that had drowned. Not the flood we know, something older, something vaster, a catastrophe so complete that by the time they learned to write, the details had already begun to blur into myth. How does a civilization that appeared suddenly, with writing already perfected, with mathematics already sophisticated, with astronomy already precise, how does such a civilization emerge from nothing unless it didn't, unless the Sumerians weren't the beginning at all, unless they were the survivors, the inheritors, the ones who rebuilt after something ended? And if their tablets describe a flood older than the flood we've celebrated for millennia, then what else are we wrong about? What came before the beginning? Tonight, as you drift with me through this ancient mystery, you don't need to remember any of it. Just let the story unfold at its own quiet pace, like water flowing through channels carved by time. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts soften. Let the weight of the day dissolve. We're going to walk through buried cities and forgotten valleys. We're going to read what the clay whispers. We're going to explore the spaces between what we know and what the earth remembers. And somewhere between waking and sleep, between certainty and wonder, the truth might find you. The Sumerians are waiting. Their tablets are patient. And the flood, the real flood, the one older than memory, it's about to reveal itself. The year was 1929, and the heat of southern Iraq pressed down like a weight you could taste. British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley stood at the edge of a trench, watching his workers dig deeper into the earth beneath the ancient city of Ur. They had been excavating for weeks, finding pottery, tools, the scattered remains of human habitation stretching back thousands of years. And then the shovel struck something different. Not artifacts, not walls, silt, pure, clean, water-laid silt, 2 meters thick in some places, sterile, empty of any human trace, as if the world had simply stopped. Woolley's heart must have raced as he realized what he was seeing. This wasn't just sediment. This was a boundary, a line drawn across time by water so powerful it had buried everything in its path. Above the silt layer, the remains of one civilization. Below it, traces of another, older, stranger. For a moment, standing in that trench with the Iraqi sun burning overhead, Woolley believed he had found it. The flood, the biblical deluge that washed the world clean, the catastrophe that divided history into before and after. Newspapers celebrated. Museums prepared exhibitions. For decades, that layer of silt became shorthand for the moment human civilization pressed reset. But the earth, patient and honest, was about to complicate everything. Because when other archaeologists returned to those same trenches and dug deeper, past Woolley's famous flood layer, they found something that shouldn't have been possible. Cities, not scattered camps. Not primitive beginnings. Cities, organized foundations. Stone platforms for temples. Walls aligned with precision. Evidence of irrigation channels. Storage facilities. Graves arranged in careful rows. Trade goods from hundreds of miles away. Pottery that showed not experimentation, but mastery. At Eridu, the city the Sumerians themselves called the first, excavators uncovered something even more unsettling. 18 separate layers of rebuilding, 18 levels, each one constructed atop the ruins of the last. The deepest dated to approximately 5,400 BC, more than 2,000 years before the flood Woolley had identified. 2,000 years of continuous habitation, of trade, of ritual, of life, which means the catastrophe Woolley found, the one that matched the tablet so perfectly, couldn't have been the beginning of civilization. It happened during civilization, perhaps even late in its development. Let that settle for a moment. Like silt after water recedes, if cities existed before the famous flood, then what was the flood actually ending? And if the Sumerians described it as total, mountains covered, the earth returned to its beginning, were they exaggerating, mythologizing a local disaster, or were they remembering something else entirely? Something older, something vaster, something that happened not in river valleys, but on coastlines that no longer exist. If your eyes feel heavier now, that's perfectly natural. You're safe here. The story will continue whether you follow every word or drift between them like smoke through evening air. The tablets don't lie. Clay can't exaggerate. It only holds what's pressed into it and hardens around that shape forever. When a Sumerian scribe carved the story of the flood into wet clay, he wasn't inventing, he was preserving. But preserving what? We assume memory moves in straight lines, that when someone writes about the past, they're describing events from 1 or 2 generations back. But memory doesn't work that way. Memory compresses. It pulls. It merges. A grandmother's story becomes a great-grandmother's, becomes a legend, becomes a truth so old no one remembers where it started. What if the flood in the tablets wasn't describing the disaster Woolley found? What if that layer of silt, that 2-meter boundary, was only the most recent catastrophe? The last one close enough to still carry names, details, a coherent narrative, and beneath it, buried under older layers of earth and older layers of forgetting, was the flood they were truly trying to preserve, the one so vast it didn't just reshape a river valley, the one that drowned coastlines, swallowed entire landscapes, redrew the map of the world itself. At night, when the museums close and the corridors fall silent, I imagine those tablets resting in their climate-controlled cases, each one a frozen moment of someone's desperate need to remember. The fingers that shape those marks are dust now. The cities they described are buried under meters of sand and silt, but the memory survives, and it whispers something we're only now beginning to hear, that the flood in the tablets, the one scholars thought they understood, wasn't the only deluge. It was just the last one anyone could still write about. Before it, there was another, older, larger, so catastrophic that by the time the Sumerians rose to power, it had already faded into myth, which means the question isn't whether the Great Flood happened. The question is, which flood are we talking about? The ruins of Eridu rise from the Iraqi desert like broken teeth, jagged, sun-bleached, half swallowed by sand. In summer, the heat here becomes something physical, pressing down until the air shimmers and distance loses all meaning. This is where the Sumerians believed everything began, where kingship descended from heaven, where the god Enki first established his temple, where civilization itself was born. So when excavations began in the 1940s and 1950s, archaeologists expected confirmation. The oldest settlement, the foundation upon which all later cities were built, instead, they found something that shouldn't exist. 18 levels of rebuilding, not scattered ruins, not the crude beginnings of trial and error. 18 separate layers, each one built atop the last, stretching back not hundreds of years, but millennia. The deepest levels dated to 5400 BC, more than 2,000 years before Woolley's flood. More than 7,000 years ago. Let that time span settle in your mind like sediment in still water. 7,000 years. That's older than the Egyptian pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than almost everything we think of as ancient. And at that impossible depth, the excavators found not chaos but intention. A small temple platform, carefully oriented, mud brick walls reinforced with reed matting, an engineering technique that required knowledge of how materials behave under stress. Floors plastered with gypsum, painted red, evidence of fish offerings left in ritual contexts. Their bones still articulated where they'd been placed, and most telling of all, imported materials. Obsidian from Anatolia, hundreds of miles to the north. Shells from the Persian Gulf. Bitumen from natural seeps upriver, which means the people who built the earliest layers of Eridu weren't isolated pioneers scratching at survival. They were part of a network. They had trade connections, resource management, ritual practices sophisticated enough to require permanent sacred architecture. And they existed before the flood that every textbook once said started civilization. You may find your thoughts beginning to wander now, drifting like leaves on slow water. That's perfectly fine. You don't need to hold on to every detail. The story will carry you. As excavations continued, the layers revealed something even stranger. The city didn't start small and grow larger. It started with a temple and built outward from that sacred center. Each new level rebuilt the temple directly atop the old one, maintaining the same orientation. the same sacred geometry, the same ritual purpose. 1,500 years of continuous worship at the same spot, each generation honoring the foundations laid by those who came before. Then, the flood layers appear, not one, but several at different depths. Each time, the settlement paused. Water scoured the surface. Silt covered what had been. But then the building resumed. Same location, same purpose. The people who returned after each flood weren't starting over from nothing. They were continuing. Continuing what? The pattern repeated itself across southern Mesopotamia at Ur. Woolley's team noted unexpected complexity in the pre-flood levels. At Shuruppak, excavators found not one but 3 distinct flood layers, stacked atop each other like geological scars. And beneath every single layer, evidence of habitation, rebuilding, continuity. At Kish, the report states plainly, the settlement below the flood stratum shows no signs of being foundational. These are careful phrases, the kind scholars use when the evidence contradicts the story they expected to tell. Because if the cities beneath the famous flood layer were already sophisticated, already connected by trade, already building temples, already burying their dead with ritual care, then the flood the Sumerians recorded wasn't wiping away primitive chaos to make room for civilization. It was wiping away an earlier civilization, one we're only beginning to glimpse in the deepest trenches, one whose full extent we may never know, because much of it lies beneath layers we haven't reached yet, or beneath coastlines that no longer exist. At night, when excavation sites close and trenches fill with shadow, you can stand at the edge and look down into the Earth's memory. Each layer a different chapter, each flood line a catastrophe that someone survived, but the deepest layers remain out of reach in most places, too deep, too waterlogged, too expensive to excavate safely, which means the oldest stories are still buried. And if what we've found so far was already ancient when the famous flood came, if Eridu's temples were 1,500 years old when the water rose, then what lies beneath even those foundations? The archaeological problem is simple to state, but impossible to ignore. Flood layers mark disasters. That much is clear. Water moved through these valleys with enough force to bury entire settlements under meters of sediment. Lives were lost, buildings collapsed, communities dispersed, but floods don't mark beginnings. They mark interruptions. And the deeper archaeologists dug beneath those interruptions, the more organized and sophisticated the evidence became. Better construction techniques, more refined pottery, wider trade networks, ritual continuity that stretched back into the Neolithic. Civilization didn't begin after the flood. It was already ancient when the flood came, which raises an uncomfortable question. If the cities beneath the biblical flood stratum already stood on ancient foundations, if civilization was already thousands of years old when the waters rose, could there have been a far older catastrophe that never made it into an archaeological trench at all? One that happened not in river valleys, but on coastlines that have since vanished beneath the seas? A deluge so complete that it left no layer of silt to mark its passing. Only memories carried inland by the survivors who fled. Your breath is slower now, deeper. You might notice your body growing heavier, sinking into comfort. This is exactly where you should be. Let the ancient world unfold around you like mist. The flood that never made it into an archaeological trench happened too slowly to be called a flood at all. And yet, it was the largest drowning in human history. Around 20,000 years ago, at the peak of the last ice age, sea levels stood approximately 120 meters lower than they are today. 120 meters. That's not a number easy to visualize until you realize what it means. Entire continental shelves lay exposed. The coastlines we know, where our port cities sit, where shipping lanes run, where millions of people live, were dry land, habitable, fertile, settled. The English Channel was a river valley. The Bering Strait was a land bridge connecting Asia to the Americas, and the Persian Gulf, that shallow sea we see on maps today, didn't exist. It was a vast river basin, fed by the Tigris, Euphrates, and a dozen smaller tributaries we can no longer name, because they now drain into underwater canyons. Picture it, a valley, green and fertile, where multiple rivers converged, freshwater streams, seasonal wetlands, alluvial plains perfect for early agriculture, not desert, not empty wasteland, a place where people would naturally gather, where they would plant, where they would build. And then the ice began to melt. The end of the Ice Age didn't happen overnight. It unfolded over millennia, slow on geological scales, but rapid enough that individual human lifetimes could witness the change. Coastlines that a grandmother knew as solid ground became tidal flats in her daughter's lifetime, then open water by the time her granddaughter came of age. Imagine living through that. Not as a sudden wave, but as an inexorable encroachment each year. The tide mark creeping higher each generation, entire villages forced to move inland, the places where your ancestors were buried, now beneath the surf. the hunting grounds where your people had lived for centuries, gradually swallowed by salt water. This was the reality for countless communities living on low-lying coasts during the transition between 15,000 and 7,000 BC. And some regions suffered more catastrophically than others. The Persian Gulf Basin is one such place. Today, it's a shallow sea, barely 90 meters deep at its deepest point. Most of it far shallower. But 12,000 years ago, before the meltwater reached it, the Gulf was dry land, not desert, but a river-fed valley rich with freshwater streams, seasonal wetlands, alluvial plains, the Tigris and Euphrates, along with the Karun River and several others, flowed together through this valley before emptying into the Indian Ocean somewhere near the Strait of Hormuz. Archaeological surveys using sonar mapping have detected ancient riverbeds carved into the Gulf's floor, valleys that once supported ecosystems, and almost certainly human populations, because fertile river valleys don't stay empty, not when humans are nearby. If people were living in the Persian Gulf Basin during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, and every environmental indicator suggests they would have been, then what happened to them when the sea level rose? The flooding wouldn't have been uniform. It would have been pulsed. Periods of relative stability interrupted by rapid surges as ice dams collapsed and meltwater poured into the oceans. And because the Gulf Basin is so shallow, even modest sea level increases would have translated into massive horizontal flooding, kilometers of coastline submerged in a matter of decades, or even years. By around 8,000 BC, the Persian Gulf had filled completely. An entire valley, perhaps home to some of the earliest agricultural communities in the region, vanished beneath the waves. And anyone living there would have had two choices: drown or flee inland. The Persian Gulf isn't the only place where this story played out. To the north and west, another basin was undergoing its own transformation, one that may have been even more sudden. The Black Sea. Today, it's connected to the Mediterranean via the narrow Bosporus Strait. But during the Ice Age and into the early Holocene, the Black Sea was a massive freshwater lake, sitting well below the level of the Mediterranean, a natural barrier. The land that would later become the Bosporus kept the two bodies of water separate. Then, sometime between 7,000 and 6,500 BC, estimates vary, that barrier broke. Mediterranean seawater poured through the breach, not gradually, catastrophically. Some models suggest the flow was equivalent to 200 Niagara Falls, raising the Black Sea's level by meters, flooding more than 100,000 square kilometers of coastal lowlands. If villages existed along those shores, and archaeological evidence from slightly higher ground suggests they did. They would have been submerged within days or weeks. The survivors would have witnessed not a gradual rise, but a sudden, terrifying inundation that transformed their freshwater lake into a brackish sea. This is the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, and while the exact timing and speed remain debated, the geological evidence for a dramatic flooding event is undeniable. But these regional catastrophes were symptoms of something larger. Meltwater pulse 1A, around 14 out of 500 years ago. Meltwater pulse 1B, around 11 or 500 years ago. As the Ice Age reached its final collapse, massive surges of meltwater entered the oceans. Ice sheets covering North America and Scandinavia disintegrated. Glacial lakes dammed by ice burst through their barriers. Within centuries, perhaps within decades in some regions, global sea levels rose by as much as 15 meters. 15 meters! That's enough to redraw every coastline on Earth. Low-lying river deltas, submerged, coastal plains transformed into shallow seas, island chains reduced to scattered peaks, and everywhere humans had clustered near the water for fishing, trade, transportation, they would have been displaced. You may find yourself drifting now between listening and dreaming. That's exactly right. The story doesn't need your full attention. It's here to carry you gently toward sleep. This wasn't one flood. It was a planetary reshaping. And it happened well within the range of human memory. Try to imagine what that experience would have been like. You're born in a fishing village where the sea is a day's walk from your home. By the time you're old enough to have children, the sea is half a day's walk. By the time your children are grown, it's at your doorstep. By the time your grandchildren are born, your village is gone, drowned beneath waves that never stop advancing. You move inland, you rebuild, but the water keeps coming. Eventually, you're not moving away from the coast. You're fleeing toward higher ground, toward the interior valleys, toward the rivers that still flow from mountains untouched by the rising seas. And you carry with you the memory of everything you lost. The fishing grounds, the villages, the graves of your ancestors, now buried under fathoms of salt water. You tell your children about the world before the water came. They tell their children. Generations pass. The details blur. How fast it happened, exactly where the coastline used to run. But the essential truth remains. Once, there was land where now there is only sea. Once, we lived beside water that we controlled. Then the water rose, and the world we knew drowned. This is the flood older than the flood. Not the one that left a layer of silt in Mesopotamian cities around 2900 BC, the one that erased entire landscapes between 11,000 and 7,000 BC, before Sumer existed, before writing existed, before the cities we've excavated had even been imagined. A catastrophe so vast it couldn't be contained in a single trench or dated by a single sediment layer, one that lives not in archaeology, but in geology, in drowned river valleys, in submerged coastlines, in the shape of the world itself. If such cataclysms reshaped coastlines thousands of years before the Sumerians pressed their first marks into clay, if entire communities were forced inland by waters that never stopped rising, then how could a civilization that came later possibly remember them? Unless those displaced peoples carried their memories north and east, up the river valleys, toward the places where their descendants would eventually build cities and invent writing and preserve in tablets the echo of a world drowned long before history began to keep records. What happens to memory when the land that holds it disappears beneath the sea, the Persian Gulf Basin, that fertile river valley that once stretched from the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates down to the Indian Ocean, lies now under 50 to 90 meters of water. If settlements existed there during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, they're beyond reach, buried under millennia of marine sediment, coral growth, the accumulated debris of modern shipping lanes. No excavation has touched them. No trench has revealed their foundations. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, and everything we know about human behavior suggests that if the Gulf Basin was habitable, and it was, then it was inhabited. Consider the geography. Multiple rivers converging into a single valley. Fresh water flowing year-round. Alluvial soils deposited by floods that were seasonal, predictable, manageable. The kind of landscape where wild grasses grow densely enough to make cultivation not just possible, but inevitable. The kind of environment that draws people in and holds them across generations. We know communities were living nearby, settlements dated to 10,000 BC and earlier dot the highlands surrounding the Gulf. In the Zagros Mountains, along the edges of the Arabian Peninsula, in the hills of southwestern Iran. These were hunter-gatherers transitioning to early agriculture, experimenting with plant domestication, beginning to stay in one place long enough to build permanent structures. But the richest land, the most fertile, the most accessible, would have been at lower elevations, in the valley itself, the valley that no longer exists above water. When the seas rose and the Gulf began to fill, those communities didn't simply vanish. They moved. Migration, especially forced migration, follows predictable patterns. People don't scatter randomly. They move along routes they already know. Trade paths, hunting grounds, river courses, and in the case of the Gulf Basin, the escape routes were obvious. Follow the rivers upstream, up the Tigris toward the northern plains, up the Euphrates toward Syria and Anatolia, up the Karun into the Zagros foothills. These weren't journeys into the unknown. They were retreats along familiar waterways, carrying everything that could be carried and leaving behind everything that couldn't, including the dead, including the architecture, including the physical proof that they had ever been there. But they carried something else, something that doesn't fossilize, but also doesn't disappear. They carried memory, not just individual memories. My grandfather's house, the fishing spot near the delta, but collective memory, the kind embedded in ritual, in seasonal calendars, in origin, stories told around fires. Memory of how to plant, how to irrigate, how to organize labor for communal projects, how to honor the gods who controlled the water, and woven through all of it, the memory of the flood, not as myth, but as lived catastrophe, the event that ended one world and forced the beginning of another, the reason why here is not home, why the old places are gone, why the ancestors sleep beneath water instead of earth. For refugees, the flood isn't backstory. It's the story, the event that explains why everything changed. Your body knows how to rest. You don't have to try. Just let yourself be held by the darkness, by the softness, by the ancient rhythm of this tale. When archaeologists map early Mesopotamian settlement patterns, something curious emerges. The oldest sites, Eridu, the Ubaid period villages, the proto-urban clusters along the lower Euphrates. They appear suddenly around 6,500 to 5,400 BC, not gradually, but as if someone flipped a switch and civilization materialized along the rivers. Before that, the archaeological record is sparse in southern Mesopotamia, a few scattered camps, evidence of seasonal occupation, nothing permanent. Then, within a few centuries, permanent architecture, pottery traditions, organized agriculture, ritual centers, long-distance trade networks, the kind of complexity that usually takes millennia to develop, unless it didn't develop locally, unless it arrived already formed, carried by people who had practiced these skills somewhere else, somewhere now inaccessible to excavation, because it's underwater. This is the hypothesis that makes archaeologists uncomfortable. Because it's unfalsifiable. You can't prove something existed if the place where it existed is now beneath the sea. But you can look at where the refugees would have gone and notice that the earliest cities in Mesopotamia cluster exactly where you'd expect refugees from the Gulf to settle, where the rivers that once drained through their homeland emerged from the highlands into the flat alluvial plains right at the edge of the former coastline. Eridu sits less than 12 miles from the current Persian Gulf shore. In 5400 BC, when its earliest levels were constructed, the coastline was still advancing. The Gulf was still filling, still reclaiming land, still pushing survivors inland. And what did those earliest settlers at Eridu build first? Not houses, not walls, not storage facilities, a temple, a structure dedicated to Enki, the god of fresh water, of the underground aquifer, of the Abzu. The Sumerians would later describe Enki as dwelling in the Abzu, the primordial waters beneath the earth, waters that were fresh, not salt, waters that represented life, not destruction. It's the kind of deity you'd honor if you'd fled from rising salt water. If your ancestral lands had been swallowed by the sea, and fresh water, reliable, life-giving, controllable fresh water, had become the difference between survival and extinction. The earliest temple at Eridu faces southeast toward the Gulf, toward the waters that took everything for refugees. Origin stories aren't optional. They're essential. They answer the question every displaced generation asks: why are we here and not there? And the answer becomes sacred. It becomes ritual. It becomes the foundation of identity. We are here because the waters rose. We survived because the gods warned us. We rebuilt because we carried knowledge from the old world into the new. As centuries pass, the geographical specifics fade. Which river valley exactly? Which coastline? How fast did the water rise? These details erode like pottery exposed to rain, but the structure remains. There was a world. It drowned. We survived. We remember. And eventually, that memory becomes text, pressed into clay by scribes who are the distant descendants of refugees, recording a story they received from their ancestors who received it from theirs, stretching back to the generation that actually watched the sea swallow their homes. The Sumerians called themselves the black-headed people. But they never claimed to be the first people. Their own texts acknowledge earlier inhabitants, earlier wisdom, earlier cities built by gods and antediluvian kings whose reigns stretched across impossible spans of time. They saw themselves as inheritors, preservers, the ones who carried forward what had almost been lost, and their cities, built at the confluence of rivers and the edge of the advancing sea, may represent not the birth of civilization, but its relocation. A second generation of an older tradition, rebuilt on higher ground by people who knew exactly what happens when you settle too close to water. If the Sumerians were inheritors of flood refugees, if their civilization was seeded by people fleeing drowned coastlands, do their own tablets show signs that they knew they were remembering someone else's disaster? Are there clues in the language, the king lists, the myths themselves, that point not to Sumer's own flood, but to a catastrophe they inherited as memory? There's a document that doesn't make sense unless you stop thinking of it as history and start thinking of it as geology. The Sumerian King List, we've touched on it before. Those impossible rain lengths, the abrupt flood dividing one era from another. But now, with the context of drowned coastlines and refugee memory, the King List stops looking like bad record keeping and starts looking like something else entirely. A timeline written not in years, but in catastrophes. A chronicle of authority that resets every time water rewrites the world. The King List opens with a line that still unsettles after 4,000 years. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was an Eridu, not began, not was established, descended, as if authority itself arrived from somewhere else, already formed, and settled into Eridu like silt after a flood. What follows is a sequence of 8 kings ruling from 5 different cities before the famous flood. Alulim in Eridu, 28 of 800 years. Alalgar in Eridu, 36,000 years. And Menluana in Badtabira, 3,200 years. The combined reigns total more than 240,000 years. Then comes the line that divides everything. The flood swept over after that single sentence. Kingship descends from heaven again, but this time the numbers change. The kings who rule in the post-flood dynasties still have impossibly long reigns by our standards, some lasting hundreds of years. But their human scale compared to what came before, Etana of Kish, 500 years, and Mibaraj Sea of Kish, 900 years. By the time we reach Gilgamesh, the reigns have shrunk to decades, and by the historical dynasties that we can verify through archaeology, the numbers finally match reality. Mainstream scholarship treats the pre-flood kings as mythological. The numbers can't be literal, so they must be symbolic. Perhaps representing months instead of years, or encoding astronomical cycles, or simply exaggerating to convey divine authority. But here's what makes that explanation uncomfortable. The Sumerian scribes who copied and maintained the King List didn't treat it as mythology. They copied it with the same bureaucratic precision they used for grain tallies and tax records. They updated it as new dynasties came to power. They cross-referenced it with other documents. To them, this wasn't legend. This was memory, and memory, especially old memory, doesn't preserve details accurately, but it does preserve structure. The structure of the King List is simple. Authority descends, time passes, catastrophe strikes. Authority descends again. What if that structure is real, even if the numbers aren't? Because the flood mentioned in the King List isn't the only disruption recorded. After the famous deluge, kingship moves from city to city. Kish, Uruk, Lagash, back to Uruk. Each relocation is marked by phrases like struck down, or its kingship was carried off, or the city fell. These aren't peaceful transitions. They're ruptures, collapses, moments when one center of power ends and another begins. And embedded in some versions of the list are references to cities that were washed away or destroyed by water after the main flood narrative. Not the same event, but echoes of it. Smaller catastrophes that follow the same pattern. Water rises, cities fall, survivors rebuild elsewhere, which suggests the scribes weren't recording one flood followed by stable continuity. They were recording a world where flooding was recurrent, part of the rhythm of existence, not an exception to it. You might feel your mind wandering now, moving between waking and sleep like tide between shore and sea. There's no need to resist. Let yourself float. Here's the possibility that keeps surfacing in the gaps between the text. What if the King List is compressing two separate catastrophes into one narrative framework? The first flood, the one represented by those impossibly long pre-flood rains, might preserve the memory of the ancient coastline drownings, the Persian Gulf filling, the Black Sea breach, meltwater pulse 1A and 1B, events that occurred between 11,000 and 7,000 BC, long before the Sumerians existed as a distinct culture. Those memories would have been carried by refugees moving inland, passed down through dozens of generations, growing more mythic with each retelling until the details dissolved. But the essential truth remained. There was a world before it drowned. Authority had to be reestablished. Then, thousands of years later, comes the second flood. The one Woolley found, a massive but regional river flood around 2100 BC that devastated cities like Ur and Shuruppak. Real, documentable, within the range of historical memory. The scribes who compiled the King List inherited stories about both events. But by the time they were writing in the 3rd millennium BC, the two catastrophes had already merged in cultural memory. The ancient mega flood and the recent river disaster had become one archetypal flood, the event that divided all time into before and after. So they structured their chronicle around that division, placing the impossibly ancient kings on one side and the more recent dynasties on the other. with a single flood line cutting between them, not because they were confused, but because that's how trauma works. Multiple disasters collapse into one defining moment. The flood becomes the flood, and there's something else embedded in the structure, something that goes beyond linear time entirely. The King List doesn't just record a sequence, it records a cycle. Kingship descends from heaven, cities rise, corruption spreads, or chaos grows, or humanity becomes too loud, too numerous, too disruptive. The gods respond with water, survivors rebuild. Kingship descends again. This is how cultures that have experienced repeated catastrophe understand time, not as a line moving forward, but as a wheel that turns, order and chaos, building and drowning, memory and forgetting. The Mesopotamians lived in a landscape where floods were annual events. They understood more intimately than we do that water gives and water takes away. The rivers that made their civilization possible also threatened to destroy it every spring. When the snow melt arrived from the mountains, so when they recorded their deepest past, they structured it around the same rhythm they lived with every year: rise, destruction, rebuilding, rise, destruction, rebuilding. The flood in the King List might be singular in the text, but it represents something plural in experience. All the times water has reset the world, condensed into one narrative moment that could be remembered, ritualized, and passed down at night. In the British Museum, tablet WB4404 rests in a climate-controlled drawer. It's one of the oldest surviving copies of the King List, inscribed sometime in the early 2nd millennium BC. The clay is brown, fractured along one edge. The cuneiform is dense, compressed. The stylus marks so small you need magnification to read them clearly. Somewhere in the middle of that tablet, pressed into the clay more than 4,000 years ago, is the line. The flood swept over. 4 words in translation, fewer in Sumerian. But those words carried the weight of every disaster the scribes remembered, stretching back to a time before writing, before cities, before the landscape itself had settled into its current shape. They weren't recording history. They were preserving the shape of catastrophe. And if you trace that shape carefully, if you follow the structure instead of arguing about the numbers, you start to see what they saw: a world that has drowned more than once and will drown again. If the Sumerians encoded cycles of destruction into their timekeeping, if the King List preserves not one flood, but the memory of many collapsed into a single dividing line, then do we see the same pattern elsewhere? Do other cultures, separated by oceans and continents, also remember a world that ended in water, more than once. The flood didn't happen in one place, or rather, the memory of flood doesn't belong to one people. If you map every culture that preserves a story about the world drowning, about waters rising to cover mountains, about a chosen survivor who rebuilds humanity, about divine judgment and catastrophic reset, you don't get a cluster. You get a planet. From Mesopotamia to Greece to India to the Pacific Islands to the Americas. The story repeats, not identically, but structurally, as if something happened that was too vast to belong to any single tradition. So, it settled into all of them. The Mesopotamian version is the oldest one we can read. Ziusudra in Sumerian, Atrahasis in Akkadian, Utnapishtim in the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh. The details shift slightly between versions, but the core remains constant. The gods grow tired of humanity's noise, their chaos, their disruption of divine order. They decide to send a flood, total, final, absolute. But one god takes pity. Enki warns a righteous man, build a boat, seal it with bitumen, bring your family, craftsmen, animals. The flood comes, 7 days and 7 nights. The waters cover everything. Mountains vanish. When it ends, the boat rests on a peak. The survivor makes an offering. The gods, seeing that life persists, grant him immortality. This became the template, the story against which all other flood narratives would eventually be measured. But the template predates its writing, and similar patterns emerge in places that had no contact with Mesopotamia for thousands of years. In Hebrew tradition, Noah and the Ark. The story matches the Mesopotamian structure almost beat for beat. Divine decision to flood the earth. One man warned, a boat with specific dimensions. Animals brought aboard in pairs. Rain for 40 days. Waters covering the mountains. The vessel coming to rest on Ararat. A dove sent out to test the waters. A covenant with the divine after the flood ends. Scholars have long noted the parallels. The Genesis account was almost certainly influenced by older Mesopotamian traditions, borrowed, adapted, reshaped by cultures that encountered each other through trade, conquest, and migration. But then you move beyond the Near East, and the echoes continue in Hindu tradition. Manu and the fish. Manu, the first man, finds a small fish that asks for protection. He raises it in a jar, then a pond, then the ocean as it grows. The fish warns him that a great flood is coming. It tells him to build a boat and fill it with seeds and animals. When the deluge arrives, the fish, now revealed as Matsya, an avatar of Vishnu, guides the boat through the flood by its horn. Manu survives. From him, humanity begins again. Different God, different geography, but the structure holds. Warning, boat, survival, reset. In Greek tradition, Deucalion and Pyrrha, Zeus decides to destroy humanity with a flood. Prometheus warns his son Deucalion to build a chest and stock it with provisions. The flood comes for 9 days and nights. Rain drowns the world. Deucalion's chest floats until it reaches Mount Parnassus. After the waters recede, he and his wife Pyrrha are the only survivors. They repopulate the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders, which transform into people. Again, divine judgment, chosen survivors, a vessel, a mountain, rebirth, cross the ocean, and the pattern persists among the Aztecs. The world has been destroyed and remade 4 times. The 4th world ended in flood. Nahuatl, 4 water. The gods flooded the earth, turning humans into fish. Only a man and woman survived in a hollowed log, and from them, the 5th world began. Among the Hopi of North America, the 1st world was destroyed by fire, the 2nd world by ice, and the 3rd world by flood. A select few were saved by Spider-Woman, who guided them to hollow reeds where they floated until the waters receded. In the Pacific, the Maori tell of Tauhaki, who caused a great flood that drowned the earth, sparing only those who climbed to mountain peaks. In Aboriginal Australian traditions, stories of rising seas and drowned coastal lands are embedded in oral history, with enough geographical detail that some scholars believe they preserve actual memories of post-glacial flooding along the Australian coast. Your thoughts may be drifting like clouds now, soft and shapeless. You don't need to follow every word. The pattern will hold you even as you slip into deeper rest. The skeptical explanation is diffusion. That one culture's flood story spread through trade and migration, adapting to local contexts as it traveled. And certainly that happened with some variants, particularly in the Near East, where cultures were in constant contact. But diffusion doesn't explain the Pacific myths. It doesn't explain why isolated cultures with no contact to Mesopotamia for 10,000 years still structure their creation stories around catastrophic floods, which means either every culture independently invented the same narrative, unlikely, or they're all remembering something real, not one event, but many. Regional floods, tsunamis, coastal inundations during the Ice Age melt. Each culture experienced its own catastrophe and encoded it as the moment the world nearly ended. Over time, those memories merged with older, half-remembered stories carried by ancestors who fled drowned lands long before. The older flood becomes the mythic template. When a new flood comes, a river overflow, a tsunami, a hurricane storm surge. It's understood through the lens of that ancient catastrophe. The details update, but the structure remains. Water rises, the world drowns, few survive, humanity rebuilds. What's remarkable isn't that every culture has a flood myth. It's that every culture treats their flood myth as the defining event. The boundary between chaos and order, between the old world and the new. For the Sumerians, it divides the king list. For the Hebrews, it marks the covenant with God. For the Greeks, it's the moment Zeus reshapes humanity. For the Aztecs, it's the death of one world age and the birth of another. These aren't peripheral stories. They're foundational. They sit at the center of cosmology, explaining not just what happened, but why the world is the way it is now. And that suggests something deeper than diffusion or coincidence. Now, it suggests that somewhere in the deep past, water did reshape the world, not once, but repeatedly. And the people who survived carried that memory forward, embedding it so deeply in their cultural DNA that even when the details faded, even when languages changed and migration scattered populations across continents, the structure remained: water, warning, survival, rebirth. The Sumerians weren't unique in remembering. They were simply the first to write it down in a script we can still read. They had clay and styluses and the institutional stability to maintain records across generations. But the stories they preserved weren't theirs alone. They belonged to a much older, much wider web of memory, one that stretched across the entire human world, which means when we read the flood and Sumerian tablets, we're not reading about their disaster. We're reading about ours, the disaster that belongs to all of us, encoded in every tradition, every culture, every attempt to explain why the world once drowned and how humanity survived to tell about it. If humanity everywhere remembers water, if flood myths span the globe not as borrowed stories, but as parallel memories of real catastrophes, then could the Sumerians have left clues not just in their narratives, but in their most technical knowledge, in the systems they used to measure time, track the stars, and predict the cycles they believed would repeat forever? Sometimes memory hides in places that don't look like memory at all. Not in stories or poems or myths, but in systems, in mathematics, in the way a culture divides the sky or measures time or counts to 60 instead of 10. The Sumerians were obsessed with cycles. Their mathematics was built on base 60, a system so strange to us that we've mostly abandoned it, except in the places where it's too deeply embedded to remove. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These aren't natural divisions. Base 10 makes sense? We have 10 fingers, but 60? 60 is a number that only makes sense if you're tracking cycles within cycles. If you're watching the sky long enough to notice that celestial patterns repeat in nested rhythms, lunar months fitting into solar years, planetary conjunctions returning on predictable schedules, star positions shifting slowly across lifetimes. To build a mathematical system around 60, you need time, not years or decades, centuries, millennia of continuous observation passed down through generations. Or you need to inherit that system from someone who already did the watching. The Sumerians divided the sky into 12 sections, the 12 houses of the zodiac, each corresponding to a constellation the sun passes through during its annual journey. Within each section, 30 degrees. 12 times 30 equals 360. This division appears fully formed in the earliest astronomical texts we have. No experimentation, no trial versions showing how they arrived at these numbers. The system is simply there, as if it had always existed. And embedded within it is knowledge that takes longer than a human lifetime to acquire. Consider precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of stars to shift gradually over thousands of years. It takes approximately 26,000 years for the cycle to complete. That's 72 years for the stars to shift 1 degree. The Sumerians knew about precession, or at least their astronomical records hint at awareness of long-term stellar drift. They tracked not just where stars were, but where they had been. They maintained star catalogs that noted changes across generations. To recognize precession, you need one of two things: either continuous observation spanning many human lifetimes, with records meticulously maintained and compared across centuries, or you need to inherit observations from an older culture that already did the work. Your breathing has found its own rhythm now, slow and steady as ocean waves. You're safe in this darkness. The ancient numbers don't need solving, only listening to. There's something else embedded in these systems, something that connects the sky to the flood. Many ancient flood myths link water catastrophes to celestial events. In Mesopotamian tradition, the gods decree the flood after observing signs in the heavens. In some versions, unusual star configurations or planetary alignments signal the coming disaster. This isn't unique to Mesopotamia. Greek myths tied Deucalion's flood to divine displeasure marked by cosmic omens. Hindu texts link the flood of Manu to the turning of a world age, measured by celestial cycles. Mesoamerican traditions describe floods occurring at the end of cosmic eras when the calendar itself resets. The pattern suggests that ancient cultures didn't see floods as random events. They saw them as part of a larger rhythm, something predictable, cyclical, connected to the movements of sky and sea. And perhaps they had reason to, because celestial events can influence water. Lunar cycles drive tides. Solar activity affects climate patterns, long-term astronomical cycles, the eccentricity of Earth's orbit, the tilt of its axis, directly impact ice ages and warming periods. The end of the last ice age, which triggered the mega floods we've discussed, was itself an astronomical phenomenon. Earth's orbital parameters shifted. Solar radiation increased. Ice sheets collapsed. People watching the sky closely enough over long enough periods might have noticed correlations, not causation necessarily, but patterns. When certain stars rise in certain positions, when planets align in certain ways, the waters behave differently. So they encoded that knowledge, not as scientific observation. They didn't have that framework, but as divine connection. The gods decreed floods based on celestial signs, because that's how you preserve technical observation in a culture without writing. You make it sacred, and here's where it becomes haunting. When coastlines shift, when your homeland drowns and you flee inland, the one thing that doesn't change is the sky. Rivers move, mountains erode, cities fall, but the stars remain fixed, or at least their patterns do. For refugees from drowned lands, the celestial map would have been the only geography they could carry with them, the only anchor to where they came from that couldn't be taken by water. So they watched the sky. They measured it. They embedded their observations into systems of mathematics and timekeeping that would survive, even if the land itself didn't. The base 60 system, the 360-degree circle, the 12-fold division of the heavens. These might not be Sumerian inventions. They might be inheritances from people who needed the sky to be stable because everything else had proven it wasn't. And when you read the tablets with that context, certain phrases start to resonate differently. The foundations lost beneath the waves, cities swallowed by the rising waters, the lands that were turned to sea. These appear in fragments, scattered across different texts, often in contexts that seem mythological or metaphorical. Scholars have traditionally read them as poetic exaggeration, the kind of language myths used to convey totality and finality. But what if they're not exaggeration? What if they're literal descriptions preserved by people who actually watched coastlines disappear? When you know that the Persian Gulf was dry land 12,000 years ago, that the Black Sea flooded catastrophically, that sea levels rose 120 meters between the Ice Age and the Holocene. These phrases stop being metaphor and start being testimony. The lands that were turned to sea. That's not myth, that's geography. That's someone remembering when the land they lived on became ocean floor. There's a tablet, catalog number A06555 in the Louvre, that records star positions with unusual precision. Among the astronomical data, a single line appears that doesn't fit the surrounding context. In the time when the waters covered the foundations of the world. It's a chronological marker. The scribe is dating astronomical observations relative to the flood, not after the flood, but during the era when the flood was happening, as if the rising waters and the star positions were being tracked simultaneously, which suggests that whoever made these observations wasn't recording the aftermath of a sudden catastrophe. They were watching a gradual transformation, documenting both the sky and the shoreline as one remained constant and the other dissolved. Mathematics doesn't forget, neither do the stars. When cultures pass down numerical systems or astronomical observations, they're passing down more than practical tools. They're passing down the memory of when those tools were developed, what problems they were meant to solve, what landscapes they were designed to map. The Sumerian Base 60 system, their celestial divisions, their awareness of long-term cosmic cycles. These don't prove the existence of a pre-Sumerian flood civilization, but they suggest something almost as significant, that the knowledge the Sumerians possessed was older than their cities, inherited from people who watched the sky for reasons we're only beginning to understand. People who needed the heavens to be reliable because the earth had proven it wasn't. People who encoded their observations into systems so robust they'd survive millennia, long enough for us to find them pressed into clay and wonder why anyone would count to 60, divide the sky into 360 degrees, or track stars across lifetimes, unless they had lifetimes of catastrophe to remember. If the sky, the numbers, and the buried phrases all hint at a greater flood behind the famous one, if the Sumerians inherited knowledge from people who watched both stars and shorelines disappear, then what does that mean for us, standing on our own fragile coastlines as the waters begin to rise again? You may be more asleep than awake now, suspended between worlds. That's exactly right. Let the story become a dream. Let the dream carry you deeper. So let's lay it all out. Let's trace the line from trench to tablet to sky and see what shape emerges. In 1929, Leonard Woolley found a 2-meter layer of flood silt at Ur, clean, sterile, cutting between one era and another like a knife through clay. For decades, scholars treated it as proof, the physical signature of the biblical and Sumerian deluge, the moment civilization reset. But beneath that layer, archaeologists kept finding cities, not rubble or chaos, but organized foundations, ritual structures, trade networks. At Eridu, 18 levels of rebuilding stretch back to 500 and 400 BC, more than 2,000 years before Woolly's flood. At Shuruppak and Kish, multiple flood layers marked multiple disasters, each time with settlement continuing below. Civilization didn't begin after the famous flood. It was already ancient when the waters came. Zoom out further, and the geology tells an even older story. Between 15,000 and 7,000 BC, the world's coastlines disappeared. Sea levels rose 120 meters as Ice Age glaciers melted. The Persian Gulf, once a fertile river valley where early agricultural communities would have thrived, filled catastrophically, drowning everything in its path. The Black Sea transformed from a freshwater lake to a brackish sea, where Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus, submerging coastal settlements within days or weeks. Meltwater Pulse 1b, around 11,500 years ago, raised global sea levels by up to 15 meters in a matter of centuries. Not a single day's flood, but rapid enough that individual lifetimes witnessed shorelines retreating kilometers inland. People living on those coasts didn't vanish. They fled. Up the Tigris, up the Euphrates, up every river valley that led away from the advancing sea, and they carried with them the memory of land that had become ocean, of villages that now rested under fathoms of salt water, of a world that drowned while the mountains stayed dry. When those refugees settled in new places, places like Eridu, at the edge of where the rivers met the receding flood, they built temples first, not homes or walls or granaries. Temples, structures dedicated to Enki, god of fresh water and the deep, oriented toward the southeast, toward the Gulf, toward the waters that had taken everything, and over centuries, as they rebuilt and their descendants multiplied. The memory of that drowning became sacred. It became the organizing principle of time itself. The Sumerian King List divides history into before and after the flood. Kings with impossibly long reigns rule before the waters come, not because they actually lived for tens of thousands of years, but because the memory they represent stretches back across countless generations to a time before cities, before writing, before the landscape itself had settled into its current shape. Then the flood line. Then kingship begins again, with shorter reigns, with numbers that slowly approach human scale. Two catastrophes. the ancient mega flood, and the later Mesopotamian river disaster, compressed into one narrative structure, because that's how memory works when it gets old. Multiple drownings become the flood, and it's not just the Sumerians who remember. Across the planet, cultures separated by oceans and millennia tell the same structural story. Noah and the Ark, Manu and the fish, Deucalion and Pyrrha, the Aztec world age that ended in water, the Hopi's third world drowned by Spider-Woman, Aboriginal Australian songs that encode the memory of coastlines that vanished 10,000 years ago. These aren't borrowed stories, they're parallel memories, different peoples experiencing different catastrophes. Regional floods, tsunamis, rising seas, all interpreting those disasters through the lens of an older template, a mythic structure inherited from ancestors who survived the first great drowning at the end of the Ice Age. The flood myths don't prove one global deluge. They prove something more unsettling. That water has reshaped the world repeatedly, and humanity has survived each time by remembering. Even the mathematics carries memory. The base 60 system, the 360-degree circle, the 12 divisions of the zodiac. These aren't arbitrary inventions. They're the legacy of people who watched the sky across lifetimes, who tracked precession and planetary cycles and nested rhythms that only reveal themselves over centuries. Knowledge like that doesn't emerge from a single generation. It accumulates, it's passed down, and the Sumerians inherited it, along with phrases buried in their tablets that suddenly make sense once you know how violently seas rose. The foundations lost beneath the waves, cities swallowed, the lands that were turned to sea. Not poetry, geography. The literal description of what happens when a river valley becomes a gulf. So here's what we're left with. The great flood of Mesopotamian tradition was real. But it wasn't the first. The Sumerian tablets, those wedge-marked fragments of clay that we've spent more than a century translating, are not describing the birth of civilization. They're describing its survival after repeated drownings. The Sumerians weren't inventors. They were scribes. Their role in human history isn't to show us where complexity began, but to show us how it endures, how knowledge survives catastrophe, how memory gets encoded into ritual, pressed into clay, structured into calendars and star charts and flood stories that echo across millennia. They wrote down what others only carried in song, in fear, in the shape of their temples and the names of their gods. They took memories that stretched back to drowned coastlines and lost valleys and compressed them into texts that could outlast water, fire, empire, and time itself. And because they did, we can read the echo of a world that ended long before history began keeping records. But there's a mirror here, and it's reflecting something we'd rather not see. We too live at the edge of rising water. Our coastlines are retreating, our glaciers are melting, our sea levels are climbing, slowly enough that individual years feel stable, but fast enough that shorelines mapped in our grandparents' lifetimes no longer match reality. Miami floods during high tides. Venice is sinking. Pacific islands are disappearing. And every climate model projects more. We're living through the early stages of what future generations might remember as the flood. Not because it happens in a single week, but because it reshapes every coastline, displaces millions, and forces humanity inland, just as the Persian Gulf flooding did 12,000 years ago. We think we're watching something unprecedented, but the Sumerians already saw this. Their ancestors lived it, and they left us a message, pressed into clay, about what happens when water rewrites the world. You move, you remember, you rebuild, and if you're wise, you write it down. So the next generation knows it can happen again. Your body is so heavy now, sinking deeper into rest. The ancient world and the present world blur together, becoming one long story of water and survival. At night, when the museums close and the archive rooms go dark, the tablets rest behind glass, temperature controlled, humidity monitored, protected from the very elements that once shaped them: water, heat, time. Their surfaces still hold the pressure marks of fingers that lived 5,000 years ago. Scribes who copied texts that were already ancient when they touched the clay. Generation after generation, preserving something they may not have fully understood, but knew was too important to lose. And somewhere in those wedge-shaped marks is the memory of people standing where we stand now, watching water advance, watching familiar landscapes transform into something unrecognizable, knowing that what they built would be lost, but hoping that what they remembered might survive. We think of ourselves as the pinnacle of human achievement, the most advanced civilization ever to exist, and by many measures, we are. But the Sumerians had something we're only beginning to relearn: the knowledge that this has happened before, that the world drowns, that humanity survives by moving, adapting, remembering. They didn't see themselves as the beginning. They saw themselves as inheritors of an older wisdom, carriers of a memory that predated their cities and would outlast them. And they were right, because we're still reading what they wrote, still translating their flood stories, still asking the questions they knew we'd ask. Where did this knowledge come from? What came before? How many times has the world ended and begun again? The tablets don't answer those questions directly. They can't. The details have eroded. The chronology is blurred. The oldest memories have compressed into myth. But they do something more important. They remind us that we're not the first to face rising waters. We're not the first to watch coastlines disappear. We're not the first to realize too late that the ground beneath us was never as stable as we believed. The Sumerians were witnesses to two floods, one written in clay, one written in the earth itself, one within historical memory, one so old it had become myth. And now we stand at the edge of another, watching the waters rise, knowing what's coming, wondering what we'll leave behind for whoever comes after. If the Sumerian tablets remember a flood older than the flood, if their impossible king lists and mythic chronologies are actually preserving something real, something vast, something that happened before cities or writing or the landscape we call home, then what stories will be left behind to remember us when the waters rise again, as they're already beginning to? What will future archaeologists find? What memories will survive in whatever form memory takes when our digital archives corrode and our cities sink and our certainties dissolve? Will they read our records and wonder, as we wonder now, whether we knew what was coming? Will they see us as beginners or as inheritors? Will they understand that we too were trying to preserve something, trying to write down the warning, trying to hold on to knowledge while the shoreline shifted beneath us? Or will they simply find the layer we left behind? Plastic, concrete, steel, and treat it the way we treated Woolley's flood silt, as proof of catastrophe, evidence of an ending, the boundary between one world and whatever comes next. You're almost entirely asleep now, barely holding the thread of this story. That's perfect. Let it become background. Let it become the rhythm of your breathing. The tablets rest in darkness, breathing slowly, holding secrets we're still learning to hear. And somewhere beneath museum glass, pressed into clay 5,000 years ago, the Sumerians are still whispering. This has happened before. The waters rose, the world changed. We survived by remembering. Will you? In the deepest archives, where scholars work in silence, the ancient clay waits, patient as stone, soft as sleep, holding memories of water and the endless cycle of drowning and survival and